Welcome to our class on the Book of Daniel. My name is John Galloway, and I'm from East Kilbride in Scotland. This lesson was presented on Thursday evening, 7th January 2021, in a Zoom class for the British Bible School, as the UK is back in lockdown. The image we are using for our title screen is a detail from the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, which was built by King Nebuchadnezzar in 575 BC on the north side of that city. It is in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, where the entire gate has been reconstructed. As lions feature in chapter 6 of the book, I thought this image would do well to introduce this particular study, both because it's a lion and because it's from the right era. Our plan in our first lesson is to deal with a few introductory matters and also to cover chapter 1. The book of Daniel is listed in our Bibles as part of the prophets. It's where we find it in the Septuagint. In the Hebrew scriptures, this is part of the Ketuvim, the writings, and comes between Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Although in my copy of the Tanakh, as you can see, they've separated Ezra and Nehemiah. But to the Hebrews, the book of Daniel was not a book of prophecy in the sense of delivering God's message to Israel, and therefore they've placed it in the writings. Let me say something about the author and date of this book. As we go through the book, especially the latter chapters, we're going to see a man named Daniel receiving visions, and from the earlier chapters, we see that he is the central character. Jesus recognized Daniel as the writer, at least of the latter section. If you remember when speaking about Jerusalem's impending destruction by Rome, recorded in Matthew 24, verse 15, amongst other places, he said, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken about by the prophet Daniel." In my view, the evidence within the book would place this being written during the events that it records. It covers the period from the first exile to Babylon in 605 BC, to the fall of Babylon, the Medes and Persians, then on into the reign of King Cyrus and also King Darius mentioned as well, around 530 BC. If you read a modern commentary, you'll discover that modern scholarship does not hold that Daniel was the writer, and that it is a late composition. Usually it's suggested it was written during the Maccabean period there, the 2nd century BC. Their main problems with this book centers on the predictions, some of the miraculous it records, and even the text, the language, and some of the history. Now, there is a school of thought, largely beginning in the 1800s, which rejects any prophetic text that gives predictions of the future that are accurate. I believe, though, that archaeology is pushing the date further back to where it should be and confirms the details found in the book. In fact, I find it almost amusing that many want to date this book as being written the 2nd century BC, yet it's found in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which dates from the 3rd century BC. If it wasn't written until 100 years after the Septuagint was translated, how did it get into the Septuagint? One writer, Joyce Baldwin of the Tyndale Old Testament Commentaries, said that this book is so controversial that opinions are divided on almost every issue. G.T. Manley, in the New Bible Handbook, commented that if it weren't for the supernatural elements in the book, there would be no question as to the genuineness of this book. I like Homer Haley's approach to this question. He wrote, "Who was Daniel? Was he a fictitious character, or was he God's prophet in the 6th century BC? Liberal scholars have gone to great lengths to discredit Daniel as a prophet of the 6th century so that they could bring the date of the book bearing his name down to the 2nd century BC. Also, they attempt to establish multiple authorship in order to deny that Daniel was the sole author. One who believes that the Bible is a document written by inspired men, the answer is simple. Daniel was named as a younger contemporary twice because of his righteousness in Ezekiel, and once by the same prophet because of his wisdom. 2 New Testament writers quote Jesus, who called him Daniel the prophet. Furthermore, Jesus and Paul testified that at the mouth of two witnesses or 3 shall every word be established. There is sufficient testimony to resolve the problem of identification. The book was written by Daniel the prophet of the 6th century BC. And I believe that is correct, and that's the view that I'm going to take in this particular study. Let's look at just a minute on a timeline for this particular book to see how it all fits together in a historical context. Chapter 1 would take place in 605 BC. That's when Nebuchadnezzar had his first defeat of Judah, the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim of Judah. This is when we had the first exile, the first deportation to Babylon, and Daniel was part of that first exile. Chapter 2 takes place a couple of years later, 603 BC, I'm dating it. Just after that, a few years later, we had the second deportation. It's not mentioned in this book, but that took place in 597 BC. That's when Ezekiel was exiled to Babylon. Chapter 3 is undated. For some reason in my notes, I have it as 586 BC, and I'm not sure why. I'll look that up when we study chapter 3. But Jerusalem was destroyed in 586, and we had that last exile, that last deportation to Babylon, and Jeremiah, if you remember, ended up in Egypt. Chapter 4 is also undated, but as this section from chapters 1 to 6 seems to be chronological, place it between chapter 3 and chapter 5, obviously. It is about Nebuchadnezzar, so it's before his death. Chapter 5 drops us down to 539 BC. This was the last year of King Belshazzar, and this is when Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians. Chapter 6 opens up with Darius the Mede. So he's one of the Medes and Persians. We have no information really on him historically, so it's hard to place him. But I'm placing it just obviously after chapter 5, and I think that makes sense. But we get to chapter 7, which begins the section of the book that deals with the visions. It goes back into different eras. So chapters 1 to 6, as you can see, seem to be, and most scholars would agree, are chronological, as are chapters 7 through 12, although 7 through 12 is a different chronology. Chapter 7 takes place in the first year of King Belshazzar, and we place that in 553 BC. Chapter 8 is his 3rd year, so a couple of years later, 551 BC. Chapter 9, I'm going to place in 539 BC. It's the first year of Darius. I'm going to assume that that's Darius the Mede there. That's the year that Cyrus took the throne of the Medes and Persians and decreed that the Jews could return to Israel, led by Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. Chapter 10 is the 3rd year of Darius. And the 3rd year of Darius, the group had just arrived back in Judah to begin the rebuilding of the temple. At least that was their assignment. In 530 BC, this is not mentioned, but Cambyses by this point is reigning, and the work on the temple is stopped. Chapters 11 and 12 as it seems to be coming after chapter 10. I'm going to place this in 522. I may be incorrect here. The first year of Darius is the heading on this section. The problem is we don't know if this is Darius the Great, who we do have record of, who dates from this era, or Darius the Mede. I'm going to assume it's Darius the Great. We also know that at this time period that the temple rebuilding was renewed. And then, not mentioned in the book, is that temple was completed, just to give you a context there, in 515 BC, and it was dedicated. So hopefully you can see that the structure of the book, 2 equal parts, chapters 1 to 6, incidents which happened to Daniel and his friends. Chapters 7 through 12 are 5 visions that Daniel received. And as I mentioned, these overlap chronologically. As a result, my intention is to, as much as possible, intersperse the 2 sections in our study and look at the entire book from a chronological standpoint. And I hope by doing this we can see how the entire book fits together. So our outline for study for this particular book I'm planning is going to be this. Looking at chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, then jumping to chapters 7 and 8, going to chapter 5, jumping to chapters 9 and 10, looking at chapter 6, then looking at chapters 11 and 12. And I hope this particular study works this way. So in our first lesson, we're going to be in chapter 1. And so let's get on into chapter 1. The text tells us that this is the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign as king. Now this would seem to be using a Babylonian reckoning of a reign, a way of dating the reign. That is different than Jewish dating of reigns, and the result of this, it results in a 1-year discrepancy between Jeremiah and Daniel. The That Bible Study Notes commented on this and said, apparently Daniel is following an accession year chronology, whereby the first partial year of a king's reign was reckoned as the accession year rather than as the first year of his reign. Jeremiah, on the other hand, is following a non-accession year chronology, whereby the accession year is reckoned as the first year of the king's reign. In that case, the conflict is only superficial. You should have been able to tell that obviously this has been flagged up as a problem in Jeremiah, but I think the Net Bible, in their study notes, answers the question fairly well. Daniel at this time would have been young, probably in his teens, some places between the ages of 16 and 20. F.W. Ferrer, in his commentary, suggests that Daniel and his friends were between the ages of 12 and 14. Others that I've read have suggested that he was possibly in his early 20s, maybe even around 23. If Daniel and his friends had been around 17 at this point in time, and that's sort of the dates I'm going to go with, they would have been born during Josiah's reign, and they would have experienced the reforms that Josiah brought about. They would have also lived under the 3 years of Jehoiakim's reversal of these reforms and his leading Judah into a return to idolatry. One thing we're going to see about Daniel and his 3 friends, and it comes out in chapter 1 initially, and it goes on throughout the book, is that they are devoted worshipers of Yahweh. In fact, if they were around that age book, it's very likely that he and his 3 friends would have heard Jeremiah as they grew up in Jerusalem area, and possibly other prophets trying to get those in Jerusalem to go back to God. Habakkuk in particular comes to mind. Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and besieged it. He's referred to as the king of Babylon. Your translation could have the king of Shinar, which is another name for this area. Nebuchadnezzar would have been king when Daniel wrote this, although in chronology at this time he would not yet have been on the throne, but was conducting this war on behalf of his father, who was too ill to do it. His father died very soon after this, and Nebuchadnezzar had to make a quick trip back to Babylon to secure the throne, be crowned the next king. And so he's referred to here as King Nebuchadnezzar, even though he's not yet king. By the way, that should not surprise us, because we use titles in this way as well, often calling somebody by their title long before they get the title. And so that's a very common practice amongst writers, and seems to have always been that way. This would have been, as he was going down to Jerusalem, was part of Nebuchadnezzar's conquering of the Assyrian Empire. A year earlier than this, in May or June 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Assyrians at Carchemish, bringing to an end the Assyrian Empire, at least for all practical purposes. He continued on down the eastern coast towards Jerusalem, conquering Assyrian territory, and then we find him in Jerusalem at the beginning of Daniel. He conquers Jerusalem. The indication in verse 2 is that he was successful in capturing the king, and that he took some of the items from the temple, and these he transported back to Babylon and placed them into the treasury, the text tells us, of his God. So that's an interesting phrase. Again, the Net Bible Study Notes comments on this phrase, and they point out that since gods normally had their own individual temples, Daniel 1 verse 2 probably refers to a particular deity, perhaps Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon, or Marduk's son, Nabu, after whom Nebuchadnezzar was named. The name Nebuchadnezzar means Nabu has protected the son who will inherit. Removing these articles from the temple would be a sign of Nebuchadnezzar's victory over Judah. As wars were fought in the name of a god, it would also show, at least in their minds, that their god had defeated Judah's god, and the plunder would belong to that god and would go into its temple. Jim McGuigan, in his commentary on Daniel, though, points out that it wasn't so much Nebuchadnezzar conquering, but God allowing it. He said, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't seize Jerusalem. God gives the king of Judah into his hands. And that's a good point to make as we look at what's happening from God's perspective. He also gave orders to Ashpenaz to bring some of the young men of the royal family and the nobility back to Babylon. In 1956, 4 cuneiform tablets were found in the British Museum by D.J. Wiseman, which detailed some information about this exile, this taking the young men back to Babylon. Zondervan's Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible, which was quoted by Homer Haley, said one result of this victory at Carchemish was that the Babylonians seemed to have demanded hostages of Judah as evidence of good faith toward Babylon. And it was this group which went into captivity as hostages in that 3rd year of Jehoiakim, including the young man Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar also took members of the royal families, not only of the Jews, but of the Phoenicians, the Syrians, Egyptians, and even more back to Babylon as captives. So he took some from all the nations that he had conquered. And Daniel, of course, is one of the captives taken from Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim was taken captive also, but he would return to the throne of Judah. Ashpenaz was in charge of the court officials, but the term may not be a proper name, but more of a title or description. Many translations there, rather than having Ashpenaz, which seems to be a transliteration of the Hebrew word, may have eunuch or chief eunuch instead of that. These young men that they captured were to be the best of the best. They had to be good looking as well as bright so that they could be taught the literature, language, and knowledge of the Babylonians so they could serve in the king's palace. The idea seems to be they had to be physically impressive and also have intelligence, skill, and common sense that could be molded and taught. Some translations, by the way, have Chaldeans here instead of Babylonians, the language of the Chaldeans. Chaldea is an ancient name for Babylonia. It is the name that we find in the Hebrew text. But most translations have gone with Babylon and Babylonia in order to have consistency in the translation. Some of these young men, by the way, from Judah are royalty. That would seem to indicate they're descendants of King Hezekiah, possibly even King Josiah. Part of what they were also to receive was food and drink from the king's table. This education was to take place for 3 years, at which time they would be presented to the king. And the idea there is that they would be entering the king's service. This, by the way, was in fulfillment of what God told Hezekiah after he showed a king from Babylon all his treasures. At that point in time, Babylon was not a major world power, but it was on the ascendancy. This is what Isaiah told Hezekiah. Listen to the Lord's message. Look, a time is coming when everything in your palace and the things your ancestors have accumulated to this day will be carried away to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. Some of your very own descendants whom you father will be taken away and will be made eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. That very well may indicate that these young men being trained, including Daniel and his friends, may have been made eunuchs, castrated. This was a fairly common practice at this time. Homer Haley comments that the use of eunuchs in the literal sense may have been a wise practice, for they would not be detracted from their work because of home responsibilities. They could be trusted around women at any place in the palace. 4 young men are singled out in our text, and they're the ones that we're going to see frequently and over these next few chapters. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These are all from the tribe of Judah, which may very well indicate that they're part of the royalty, descendants of King Hezekiah, and that very well could be. But they were given new Chaldean names. Daniel received the name Belteshazzar. Hananiah becomes Shadrach. Mishael, Meshach. And Azariah becomes Abednego. Many have pointed out that their original names, the meaning of the original names, gave glory to God. Daniel, it's suggested, means God is my judge, or possibly God has judged. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious. Mishael, who is what God is, or who's equal to God, seems to be the idea. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. It's been suggested that their new names reflected a pagan god, although keep in mind that we don't know what all these names absolutely mean, so there is some conjecture here. But if it's accurate, here's what we find. Belteshazzar, Bel protects his life. It's the god Bel. Or possibly Belti, another god, protect the king. That may be the meaning there. Shadrach, that's been suggested to mean command of Aku. Aku was the Babylonian moon god. Meshach, who is what Aku is, although some suggest we don't really know what Meshach means. And Abednego, servant of Nebo, Nebo being one of the gods. Nego, by the way, is a corruption of Nebo. But it's been suggested that giving them Babylonian names may have been an attempt to erase the memory of their Israelite heritage and break their connection with Yahweh in order to acclimate them as Babylonians and also to acclimate them to the Babylonian gods. I think it's of note that Daniel refers to himself during this book with his Hebrew name. And when asking for his friends for help in prayer in chapter 2, he calls them by their Hebrew names as well. If it deals with what's being recorded in Babylon, though, the Babylonian names will be found. There seems to have been some problem with the food from the king. In fact, there was a problem. It would defile the Jewish young men who ate it. We may well ask, how would the food defile them? Some have suggested that this was due to the king's food having been offered to an idol before being served and consumed. Some others have suggested that a better possibility would be that this involved meat which would not have been killed according to the Mosaic law. So it would not be, as we would say today, kosher. So it also might involve meat that Israelites could not eat. But maybe the best explanation would seem to lie in the fact that pagan food and drink would be associated with simple pagan uncleanness. What we eat, what we drink, as well as what we wear and how we speak, are all a part of our self-identity. They reflect our commitments. Daniel refuses to eat. And some have suggested that symbolizes his refusing to give up being God's Israel. He refuses to compromise. Homer Haley wrote this. He said, whether the resolve was based on his knowledge of God's law concerning clean and unclean foods, or the fear that the meats had been sacrificed to idols, is uncertain. If the latter, he would be concerned that in eating of the sacrifice, he would be having communion with the idol, that is, with the demon god that the idol represented, which would be sin. Probably both may have been in his mind. The petition was made in the form of a humble request, not a demand. So even though he doesn't want to eat it, he requests that he not have to eat it. We can see in all this that these 4 young men at least were concerned that they remained faithful to God, even though they were in a foreign country and among people who did not know them. They were determined to be true to God. So Daniel approached the overseer of the court officials. I'm assuming this is still Ashpenaz, who we saw earlier. It may not be, but I'm assuming it is. He approached him to see about getting an exception to what he ate. And it would seem to me, by reading the text, that maybe he and his 3 friends were the only ones to do this. Calvin pointed out in his commentary that by doing this, Daniel would have been risking his own head. Because of God, Ashpenaz liked Daniel, and he seems to have been a very likable character anyway. But I think we can see God intervening here in some way. Even though he had sympathy with Daniel's position, he still had to think about himself and his position with the king. If he were to allow this exception in Daniel's diet, and they ended up being in worse condition, then things wouldn't go well with him, with the king. Because after all, refusing to eat the food that the king himself ate and provided, that would be an insult to the king. And that seems to be an end of that interview. He next turned to the warden, or some translations have steward, who had been assigned to be over these four, and possibly others as well. Daniel turned to him and suggested a test. Allow him and his three friends to eat a vegetarian diet with water for 10 days, and then compare them with the other young men. Now, other translations, especially older ones you may have there, might have the word pulse here. But the reference is to vegetables, to grains, to any non-meat products in general. So I think vegetables is a better translation. The King James Version, by the way, also gives the steward a name, which again is taking his title and putting it into a name, which is probably not a good translation here. But this was a very reasonable offer, to which the warden agreed. We might ask, why just 10 days? It's been suggested that this was a short enough period not to arouse suspicion, but long enough to see the effects of this different diet. Others have suggested that the number 10 is sometimes used in the Old Testament scriptures as an ideal number of completeness, so a complete time. Either of those could be enough, or it could be that 10 was complete enough to test it. Any of that could be the idea that's going on there. At the end of this week and a half, it was seen that these four were in better shape than the ones eating the king's food. They looked better. I presume that they would have been free from any blemishes on the face. And when you consider their youthfulness, we may be talking here about acne and other blemishes that would come to mind. They were healthier in body as well. They could be seen. They had, as we often say, they had that glow about them, that healthy glow. Now, I've heard this incident try to be used to teach that God wants everyone to be a vegetarian or a vegan. A vegan, by the way, is those who not only don't eat animal products, they also will use no animal products. By the way, veganism is a very recent innovation in diet. Keep in mind, no Israelite could be a vegetarian or a vegan for that matter. Why? Well, it's very simple, isn't it? They had to eat meat. Eating of lamb as well as other meats offered in sacrifice was required of all the people of Israel in the worship of God. So being a vegetarian was not an option. It would seem that they didn't eat as much meat as we may do today, and there may be some health aspects to that, although in some of the nutrition blogs and podcasts that I listen to, even former vegetarians are saying there's nothing wrong with good meat. So there is a change in thoughts on that just now. Warren Wiersbe commented that the fact that God used a vegetarian diet to make these four young men succeed doesn't mean that we will succeed if we follow this example. The Bible makes it clear that all foods are permissible to believers. The story encourages us to follow their faith, not their diet. And I think that's a good point to make. It would seem to me, at least, that the steward, the warden, made a change in everyone's diet after this. The rich food and the wine were taken away, and all are going to now eat vegetables and drink water, because it's been shown to be a better diet. If you think about the rich diets of the nobility, you can see why this might be a better diet even today. David Reckton, in the Truth for Today commentaries, said, how did Daniel know that God would give him and his friends a better appearance and better physical and mental health than the other young people under the same tests? Daniel did not know in the empirical sense, but he had assurance because he did know his God. And I think that's the point here. He knew God and therefore trusted in God. As a result of all of this, God continued to be with these 4 faithful young men. He gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. No, I'm sure that he didn't dump that into their heads. I'm sure they had to learn it. But God is there helping them in what they're doing. Warren Wiersbe commented that these 4 Hebrew youths had to study and apply themselves, but God gave them skill to learn the material, discernment to understand it, and wisdom to know how to apply it and relate it to God's truth. And I think that is a very good point to make. To Daniel, he also gave understanding in all visions and dreams. Again, commenting from Warren Wiersbe, a heart that loves the Lord, trusts the Lord, and therefore obeys the Lord, has no difficulty making the right choices and trusting God to take care of the consequences. It has well been said that faith is not believing in spite of evidence, that's superstition, but obeying in spite of consequences. When they had to choose between God's word and the king's food, they chose the word of God. At the end of this time period, the 3 years, time came for them to be presented to Nebuchadnezzar. This would seem to be some type of interview as he looked for those who would be useful to his government. He found none like these 4. So they entered the king's service. Literally, they stood before the king, the Hebrew text says. F.W. Farrer, in his commentary on Daniel, said, they were therefore chosen to stand before the king. In other words, to become his personal attendants. As this gave free access to his presence, it involved a position not only of high honor, but of great influence. Whatever the king needed to know, these 4 were 10 times better than all his other magicians and enchanters who were his advisors. They were better in wisdom. And that seems to be there referring to the thought process that seeks to understand causes and consequences of principles. They were better in insight. Your translation might have understanding there. Talking here about perception and discernment. This, by the way, is laying the foundation for some of the conflict we're going to see in later chapters. Because the king found them better, and that made enemies for them. And we'll see that later on in the book. This chapter closes by telling us that Daniel remained in this position until the 1st year of King Cyrus, which is, of course, many years in the future, and we will get there towards the end of the book, towards the end of our studies. As we conclude our thoughts, let's ask ourselves the question, what lessons can we learn from Daniel 1? It's nice history, but what does it do for us? Well, I think, first of all, the one thing that we can see is that God is in control. And this could be one of the overarching themes in the book, because we're going to see that in every chapter of the book. John Goldingay, in the Word Biblical Commentary on Daniel, says, for people in exile, their story looks as if it had come adrift from the story of the people of God, but it's not really done so. They are still within the sphere of his activity, even though it does not look like it. They are not mere pawns on a political and geographical chessboard. To be in the hand of Nebuchadnezzar is not to be out of the control of God. The story of God's acts in history has not come to an end. The presence of the Jerusalem temple vessels in Babylon, safe in the temple treasury there, may itself offer quiet testimony to the fact that God is still at work. The articles from the Jerusalem temple are put into the shrine of the Babylonian gods as if the latter had won them. Actually, the God of Israel had given them to Nebuchadnezzar. He is in control. So one of the central themes of the book, God is in control. We can also here see God's providence at work. God working through what was going on. Think about this. It was God who allowed Nebuchadnezzar to conquer Jerusalem and take the captives. It was God who blessed Daniel and his three friends. He was taking care of his people just as he took care of Ezekiel and the exiles with him. God is in control. I think another lesson that we can see in all this is very much something we find in the New Testament scriptures. Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed. Warren Wiersbe pointed this out. He said, according to Romans 12:1 and 2, conformers are people whose lives are controlled by pressure from without. But transformers are people whose lives are controlled by power from within. Daniel and his three friends were transformers. Instead of being changed, they did the changing. God used them to transform the minds of powerful rulers and to bring great glory to his name in a pagan land. And I think that's a good lesson for us in our living. I mean, as was pointed out in our class yesterday evening, we too, in essence, live in a pagan land. And even though there's trappings of worshiping God around us, most people don't worship God. And we need to make sure that we are not conformers, but are transformers. Not allowing our culture to change us, but to be the ones that do the changing. Through, of course, God's Word. That also reminds us that we are in the world, but we are not to be of the world. John Golding commented on this. He says, we are to be citizens of two worlds, neither surrendering one citizenship by assimilation, nor surrendering the other by forming a ghetto. Yes, we're in the world, but don't be of the world. Don't assimilate the world. I think that's important for us to remember. We also see in this chapter the need to be faithful to God despite our circumstances. We see the Daniel and his three friends, that pressure put on to conform to what's going on around them, to just become like one of them, to eat what they knew that they shouldn't. They chose to remain faithful to God. And is there a lesson about what we eat? Homer Haley, in his commentary, expanded on this a lot. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I refer you to his commentary on Daniel. I think we need to remember in all of this that our being able to do what we do, the abilities that we have, are a gift from God. Just like Daniel and his three friends were blessed with knowledge and skill in all sorts of literature and wisdom. Anything that we're able to do is because of God. And we need to always remember to give him the credit. And as a result, we have these abilities. We need to be sure that we're using them. Always remember to do our part, because we have a part to play in what goes on around us. Warren Wiersbe commented that as students, all of us need to ask God for wisdom and then work hard to do our very best. Faith without works is dead, and fervent prayer can never replace faithful study. Both are necessary. Let's leave you with a closing thought. It's simply this. Each believer is either a conformer or a transformer. We're either being squeezed into the world's mold, or we're transforming things in the world into which God has put us. Transformers don't always have an easy life, but it's an exciting one. And it gives us great delight to know that God is using us to influence others. Thank you for joining us for this particular study. I hope that it has been at least of some use, and hope that you'll be able to join us for the rest of these studies that we post on YouTube We're planning every Friday after I teach the class live on Thursday nights on Zoom. You can find details of the class at the British Bible School website. Have a good day and stay safe in the times that we're living.